Are there any questions and comments to begin?
So this is to all of the panelists. As you probably know, in every religious tradition, the teachings and the resources, the theological resources in any theological or any religious tradition will not lend themselves conclusively or definitively to one conclusion or another necessarily on the environment, as George kind of said. So what do you see as the role as for the interpreter of the resources in any tradition being, and the importance of that role, just the continual interpreter of that?
Thank you. Maybe you could begin, Margaret.
Now, am I speaking so you can hear? I'm getting used to these American microphones. Right. When you have a group of people from different religious traditions, as we have here, and in my time working with the Patriarch Symposium, we had many other religious traditions represented also. One of the things we tried to look for was where we were using the same ideas, or almost the same ideas, but using different words for them. And the great importance of recognizing that technical language, and I'm very conscious of this myself, technical language can be a barrier. On the other hand, you can't just throw it away because that contains important refinements. But listening to what other people are saying and recognizing that you have a similar, or in some cases identical concept under another name. For example, we don't have a Jewish representative on this panel, but I listened a little while ago to a lovely paper, a presentation on their concept of tikkun olam. And as he was speaking, I recognized immediately that this was equivalent to the Christian concept of atonement. And in the discussion afterwards, I was able to say to people, well, as far as I can see, these two are equivalent. And we had a very interesting discussion across this. And I think one of the things that will come from today is the recognition that we have similar concepts that we can explore together, and also to recognize where the differences lie. And there are bound to be major differences on, what we think the role of the human being is, for example, or maybe the role of knowledge, I don't know. But this concept of the restoration, the atonement, the tikkun olam in the Jewish tradition, and so forth, that's something that does seem to be common to all of them, restoring, preserving, renewing. So I think exploring each other's language is an important thing that can come from a panel like this, and from even a broader spread of different religious traditions. Can I give this to you now, George?
Maybe I'll try to answer it within my own tradition for a moment, because I think it. There's a horizontal and vertical, or diachronic, and anyway, I'm thinking in terms of interfaith work as opposed to work within my faith, and both have been extraordinarily rewarding. But within my own faith, I work at, as you know, I work at Brigham Young University as a church employee, and so I recognize that I have both a little more of a voice within my tradition than I would if I were somewhere else, but not necessarily, because there have been many Latter-day Saints who've had an extraordinary voice in the tradition, like Terrell Givens, who've never been at a church institution ever. But there's an opportunity, I think, to exercise some influence on the way in which we read and the way in which we interpret, because ultimately it seems to me that that's the question, that it almost always boils down to is, how is the tradition interpreted, and what are the incentives to interpret it differently, and can you be a persuasive voice in the conversation, or and I've had to weigh that balance like a lot of people do, where if I get too shrill, if I get too critical, do suddenly I lose all my audience, or can I stay within the tradition and exemplify my faithfulness to the tradition in a way that my particular interpretation becomes persuasive? For me, I wrote about this for well over a decade, and then in 2013, Elder Marcus Nash was giving what I think was the very first formal speech by a leader of the church on the environment, and I was a nervous wreck. I was sitting in the audience thinking, I'm going to find out today whether I've been out of bounds all these times, or am I going to get shown to be wrong or whatever. And I was relieved by the end of the talk that I felt actually I was very, very emotional while he was speaking, because I could not believe how beautiful his words were and how I had felt them for so long and had been writing about them as a scholar and not as a ecclesiastical leader. And then to hear him echo what I had been writing in a way that made me feel gratified that I had tried to walk that line carefully. I think it's true not only with my fellow religionists, but it's true in the whole climate change cultural struggle, that you have to. I sort of called out climate activists for a moment in my talk, but I think if you really care about an issue, you've always got to make sure that your care about that issue is deeper than your care about being right. And I think when people make it into my worldview is right and your worldview is wrong, then it just shuts down all real, genuine dialogue. But if I'm going to be engaging with people who are deeply suspicious of everything I believe, and yet we're both members of the same tradition, I love that tension. I think that's really a healthy place to be. I love the fact that my church doesn't allow me to go to church based on political persuasion, but I go to church where I live geographically, and that means that I've got to rub shoulders with people who think differently than I do, but we're going to have to find common ground. So I don't know, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but I feel like my role as an interpreter is it's my 2 cents, but I recognize that, as a scholar working at BYU, I have people will tend to look at me with a little bit more hope for something official, but I have to be really careful not to ever say. Even the way I was introduced on the program, it implied that I was a representative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was speaking about the church's views, and as Phil Barlow had explained it to me. And I've never said anything other than that. I'm just a member, But and as I said to Elder Snow, he'll correct anything I said today that was incorrect. So.
Yeah, maybe continuing on rambling. I work for the state of Indiana, technically, not a church. And so they're different roles. And therefore, in some sense, the interpretive framework or our place as interpreters of traditions really differ according to the institutions that we find ourselves working within. So in a way, I would say I would want to represent myself as a scholar of Hinduism and as not a spokesperson for Hinduism, and there's a different role than in other institutions. And yet, I think that I look at the boundary of that it gets rather shaky at times. And I'm here. Let me give an anecdote to that. I did a study of and wrote a book on a pilgrimage in northern India, and that culminated in my book, Journey Through the 12 Forests. And during that pilgrimage, I linked up with a pilgrimage guide who then became a very dear friend of mine. And I learned a great deal from him during the pilgrimage. And as I say, I had a friendship with him after it. And somehow it was very important for me to give him access to my interpretation of his tradition. So when I finished the book, he didn't really speak English, but he actually could read it. He had an MA in English literature. And I gave him a copy of the book, and I was very, very nervous about giving him that copy. And I saw him a year later and was nervous again about encountering than his reaction, and was somehow pleased by his only complaint was that I referred to his father, but I didn't use his father's name in the book, and he was upset about that. But I tell the story for this reason. Then he, unfortunately, was a chain smoker of beaties, kind of a raw Indian cigarette, and died of lung cancer because of that. I was in a temple a number of years after his death, and this young man comes up to me out of the blue and says to me, "Are you David Haberman?" And I was stunned, like, well, yes, how would you even know me? And it turns out that he was the son of this good friend of mine, and he was now taking over the family business of guiding pilgrims around this area. And he then shared with me that he gets together with other young guides and they read my book as part of their strategy then for taking pilgrims on a journey. And I don't know what I think about that, but it makes me realize that again, that division isn't so clean. I would say only two things then. We're talking about the tradition. And again, if there's anything I've learned, that there is no such thing as Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and probably I could take it down even to more minute, that we're looking at a great deal of variety within every so-called tradition. And part of that variety is that there are cultural changes in different cultural contexts, as well as religious traditions are always changing in response to the particular historical challenges of their day. And if there is a historical challenge of our day, certainly the environmental crisis is top on that list for many. So yeah, interpretation is an ongoing process and one that's hard to get a handle on. But maybe to come back to Dr. Barker's presentation, I was thinking that if somehow when there was a new interest in reading the Bible through the Protestant Reformation with a figure like Calvin, if Calvin would have had access to an interpretation or himself would have come up with an interpretation of Adam, the way Dr. Barker is presenting it today, I wonder what the historical consequences that might have looked like.
Thank you for your question. There's different levels of interpreters here. So there's us as scholars, and then there's the practitioners who are, my case with the Buddhist monks in Thailand, who are there's minority of the total number of monks there, but they're very visible ones who are pushing the religion to be used to promote conservation and environmental awareness and change to take care of it. And they have to walk a very fine line, as Dr. Handley was talking about in his own case. Some of these monks early on, I mentioned the one who was called crazy, and there were calls for him to be disrobed. In 2005, one of the monks, who very sweet, quiet man, very unassuming, working with another monk to take care of, protect land from the encroachment of tangerine farmers, to cut down the forest to grow larger and larger tangerine populations. He was assassinated. And to this day, his murder has not been found, let alone brought to justice. And the government has mishandled the case quite a bit. And so there's tensions. I mean, in some of these cases, these monks are really confronting a certain kind of power, a very strong economic power. The belief among the monk activists and other lay supporters of them is that he was most likely murdered the murder was hired by the people that owned the tangerine production, not just individual plantation owners, but those who stood to benefit from growing and marketing these tangerines all over the world. I have trouble eating tangerines to this day. So they're also fighting against, the greed that some people have in the within a corporate world that is willing to go to great lengths. But it's also a religious interpretation. Some people have a very different reading of the Buddhist scriptures or any of the others. And so if you want to read it and promote it in terms of environmental care, I think you really do have to be very sensitive to the language you're using and to respecting the wide range of beliefs within any given place and the traditions. And it can be a very difficult line, and it can be one that you can cross and upset somebody and create enmity. And it's also one in which the monk that I've worked the most closely with, the one who told the story about the baby monkey, he's very, very conscious of the longer interpretations that he's challenging and trying to unpack them and respect them, even while he's coming up with a different way of applying them.
Next question or comment, please.
Thank you. First, I just want to say how fabulous this panel's been. I've just been so well educated by all of you. It's just been super fascinating. I have a question for Dr. Haberman. And so I was really interested in the way you talked about the Hindu tradition, seeing the landscape as sacred and seeing the divinity in the landscape. And I kind of know the answer to my question, which is going to be both and, I think. But I just wondered if in seeing these rocks as manifestations of the divine or seeing the river as a manifestation of the divine, whether there's a risk of like losing sight of the rock as a rock or the river as a river. So in other words, like, you know, in thinking about the Ganges River, which is so polluted, I mean, you could hear someone say, well, Ma Ganga is always going to take care of herself. So we don't really need to intervene in that. And I was just interested in that tension between seeing something as divine and then maybe not seeing it as it is in its own materiality.
Well, that's a great question. In some sense, the question that you're asking really raises the issue of what's the relationship between materiality and spirit, in some sense. And in a way, I guess I would point out that there's a kind of a dualism behind that. So it can't, and you've already got it, I think, with answering your own question with it's both and. So that when in the case of, I can think in my work on the Yamuna River particularly, I read much of the theological literature on that river. And the waterness of the river is essential. And the technical Sanskrit language for that's the Adibodhik Swarup of Yamuna or Ganga, because actually both rivers are talked about with that same terminology. And whereas the goddess identity of the river is what is called the Adi Daivik Swarup, which I translate something more like the divine personality of the river. And so your question within that language comes down to is focusing on the divine personality is the danger of really losing then the materiality of the water itself. And in some sense, yes, and you're right. And Kelly Ellie's book On the Bank of the Ganges was done in a period where I think she was really marking that. But I think that conversation, and she and I continue to talk about river issues a lot, has advanced. And there are many who really critique that. So that, again, in the theological literature, it's very clear that the divine personality of the river is distinct from the materiality and yet is not unrelated to that. So it's the both and I think that's what's difficult in understanding some of these non-dual traditions. We can think of polar oppositions quite easily, but to think of the simultaneity of the oppositional positions, I think becomes difficult. So that I think there's a danger, and I think that one can really lay out the concrete effects of that. But and we get at the relationship between the ideal and the real. But certainly in terms of the ideal, that should not be a broken relationship, that materiality and divinity, which is never exhausted by materiality, can never be lost. And particularly those who are eco-activists with regard, say, to the rivers, would never buy that notion that she will just take care of herself. And there's a changing discourse. And this is that concept of seva, that that loving action gets translated into what we in the West would call environmental activism. And the position that you're worried about, they're worried about too, and actually critique.
Could I just make one comment about that? Because it relates to the earlier question about interpretation too. I think one thing that's really is potentially deceptive about the work of eco-theology is that we sort of end up feeling like we've done our work if we've like interpreted the tradition in such a way that it has now a kind of correctness to it that's environmentally healthy, and it's going to, and of course the illusion is that it's going to actually produce the results that you think it's going to produce, which is another question altogether, right? So you can argue over a theology like people argue about, should anthropocentric religions just get out of the way because they're not helping us, and a biocentric philosophy of the universe is more environmentally friendly, but that assumes that you could actually responsibly track, that people who believe in anthropocentric traditions, universally destroy the environment much more rapidly than people who don't, so I find it fascinating how complicated people are. I'll meet people who have no environmental leanings per se, and yet their intuition is to take care of the environment. They're very gentle souls, and they're tender-hearted about environmental issues in a way that it would not be predicted by their beliefs. And I think that's just a mystery to me. Like, what is the sociology of religion, and why is it that religious beliefs that we think should motivate people to have better environmental behavior sometimes don't? That's what I heard in the heart of your question, is that you could have this belief that philosophically sounds really good, but it could mean that the person has distorted it or used it in such a way that justifies their own environmental indifference. And I think all I guess I'm saying is that I see it cutting both ways. I see some people with very environmentally friendly cosmologies and so on who don't necessarily enact them, and then others who don't have them but nevertheless do. So anyway, I don't know if I even said that correctly, but you get my point.
I was taken by the suggestion that Adam was a high priest rather than a steward, maybe from Dr. Barker. I'm curious about maybe a pragmatic distinction there. What does that look like in practice? How does the high priest act different from the steward, either from Dr. Barker or from any of the others who might have a thought on that? Just how do they act differently?
Right. Now, this could take up the rest of the day, but I'll try, and obviously if I'm giving a broad brush picture, the detail will disappear. The role of the high priest in the Jerusalem temple tradition was to act as the preserver of the great covenant that upheld the creation. And he has two major roles. One is a teacher, so that people know what breaks the bonds of the covenant. And then second, he had this ritual function of ritually restoring the bonds of the covenant when the people who had broken them through sin, and sin by definition is what breaks the bonds of the covenant, when people who had committed sins, first of all had repented, and second had done everything they could to restore the damage that they'd done. And they give examples like, if your ox has broken down a fence, then you don't just say sorry about it, you repair it for your neighbour, that sort of thing. When all that was done, then there was the great annual ritual that they call the Day of Atonement, and this was the ceremonial, the ritual, if you like, confirmation and affirmation that the covenant had been restored. So Adam is seen as that high priest. He is the one who has the responsibility for teaching and for leading the worship. Now, there's a lovely hymn in the Hebrew tradition, which we only have actually as a Greek text. It's embedded in the book of Daniel in the Greek translation. And this is a wonderful hymn that calls on all aspects of the creation, every element of the creation, to praise the Creator. In the church we sing it as the Benedicite, all you works of the Lord, praise ye the Lord. And the high priest is the one who leads, if you like, all creation in worshipping the Creator. And if you destroy things in the creation, then your act of destruction diminishes the praise that is due to the creation. And that is the sense in which Adam is the high priest. The steward has, yes, the idea of the responsible use of creation, that obviously is part of the high priestly thing. But when you've got the business thing and giving the best possible return on your money, and all the sort of ways that image has been used, and I speak as a Methodist preacher, so I know the sins that have been committed from the pulpit, that is the image that we have to get rid of. We have to move beyond it and go back to say, well, how was this image I speak obviously as a Christian preacher, how was this image understood when the foundation texts of Christianity were penned? For example, by St. Paul, when he talks about Jesus as the second Adam, what would that have meant? It would not have meant that he was the new steward of creation. It means that he is the new high priest, leading all creation in worship of the Creator. And so you have to get back. For me, I have to stop the kind of developing film, and I take as my still where these things were at the time of Christian origins. And then you can read Christian texts and the New Testament texts and the sub-apostolic, the early fathers, things like that. You can read those in the light of what would have been the paradigms used by, known to, the people who penned them. And then I think you can interpret them more responsibly. I think if you look at how the reception history of a text, and you then do very much a second or third hand interpretation, I think then you're getting too far away from the source for your interpretation to be anything other than of historical interest. Okay?
Brief terminological digression: anthropocentric, centered around people. Anthropology, a study of people. Biocentric, centered around biology. We've had 3 questions from 3 men, so in order to avoid androcentrism, derived andro from Adam, maybe we could have, thank you, perfect.
This is a question for Dr. Handley. So, how do you explain or, cope with the fact that church leaders haven't really spoken that much about environmental stewardship or called its members out on the fact that we have these common attitudes that are really don't align with the church doctrine?
That's a great question, and you might want to ask that later this afternoon again to Elder Snow. Maybe I'll just softball that one to him. But I think that's a very common question I get a lot, and I would say that there are a couple of principles here. First of all, I believe in the principle that's articulated in section 58 about being anxiously engaged in a good cause. This is from Doctrine and Covenants, and that if I'm waiting to be commanded in all things, then I'm a slothful servant. And so if I live my Latter-day Saint life in anticipation of the next directive I'm going to get from the leadership of the church about everything, then I'm not living my religion very well at all. And even a lot of people I know in the climate community are very anxious about this, and they're always asking me the same question too. So I get it from members of my own faith, and then I get it from people who aren't, and they'll say, well, if only the president of the church would say X, Y, or Z, it would solve all these problems. And I say, well, I'm a little skeptical about that. I mean, President Kimball gave a talk once in the 1970s about hunting, and I don't think that really changed the hunting culture in Utah a whole lot. If the church made this a part from top down, where it was, emphasized, I'm actually more interested in the curriculum of the church than I am in what the church leaders are or are not saying. I feel like there's some pretty serious deficiencies in lessons about the creation or about Adam and Eve about the law of consecration and the Doctrine and Covenants generally. I don't find the principles clearly laid out in the curriculum, but they are laid out very clearly by a church leader on the church website under stewardship and conservation and stewardship. If you look under gospel topics, under the gospel library, and also in the Mormon newsroom, you'll find a wonderful set of resources and statements by church leaders, statements by a member of the Quorum of the 70, Elder Nash, which is a full-blown talk. And I was present when he gave that talk, and a lot of members of the Latter-day Saint tradition were there begging him to give it in conference. And he said, well, I don't make that decision, but he was willing to meet with people and talk with people. And as I understand it, the result of that conversation was the website. Because I think he was willing to hear the concern, and I shared it with him privately that, I teach students at BYU and they get kind of anxious about this, and they say, look, I don't want to be out of bounds. I don't want to be, and some of my friends are telling me I am already. I'm listening to crazy talk. And so the only thing that's really going to counteract that is affirmation that this is, stewardship is central to our theology, and it's really important and maybe understood in less of a business model ethic. But as soon as they catch wind of that doctrine, I think then they feel lit up by it and they feel like they have a kind of permission. There's no doubt in my mind if and when the day comes when church leaders are talking more openly about it and more often about it, that will be a positive thing. But I don't expect them, like I've said to students, look, I don't remember a church leader saying that the genocide in Darfur was a tragedy. Does that mean it wasn't a tragedy or that it wasn't happening? Of course not. I can't expect them to address every single moral crisis in the world. Anyway, I'm trying to walk a fine line because I want it to happen. I want to hear more. But I also don't want to pretend to know why, and I don't want to diagnose that. I mean, I think a lot of people in and outside of the church try to come up with their diagnoses about why church leaders are saying one thing or another, and that's not my position. My position is a position of faith where I listen for what I feel like the Lord is trying to tell me as this church leader is speaking. I'm not listening for what I wish he were saying, so to speak, right? And I'm also trying to be as proactive as I can be in my own reading of my own tradition. So that if I bring a question like, what do I do about climate change as a member of my tradition, I will get answers. And they're right there for me. They're very strong and very present to me. And I feel like that's a personally valuable experience. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's how I just think it's a little bit dicey to just continually feel like. I'd say the same thing is true, by the way, of our elected officials in the state. I mean, we get a lot of anxiousness about when our elected officials, our congressional delegation, going to say more about it. And believe me, I wish they would say more about it. But I think waiting for them or focusing on that issue as the problem is the wrong road to go down, because it implies that they are all powerful and that they somehow with one sweeping statement change everything, and that's just not true. Laws don't change hearts, and a church talk doesn't change hearts necessarily. We have to do that work on our own.
Thank you, Miss, for your question. Can I just add that I recently saw some research given to me by an instructor here in the business school that said that children pestering their parents and grandparents is one of the most effective means of transforming attitudes about the environment. We have time for one more question, which will go to, actually, thank you, and the gentleman who gave me, Professor Stafford, gave me this wonderful research. Thank you. Because it's quite profound, not just top down, it's a little slow. Professor Gupta, the last question goes to you, sir.
So this question begins with Dr. Haberman and Dr. Darlington. This is not a criticism I share. It's not coming from me. But at the same time, I would like to hear your response about this. What about the charge of anthropomorphism? That's such a bad word in many arenas, making the world in our own human image. And both of your talks, especially Dr. Haberman's, but both had elements of that. What about that charge, and how is that connected to anthropocentrism? And then moving to Dr. Barker, what about the adjacent problem of idolatry that you mentioned in relation to anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism?
Yeah, how many hours do we have? I think and write a great deal about the difference between anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. And the conflation of those two is extremely common, and yet I think ultimately problematic. So I'm trying to work on that in a lot of what I'm doing right now. I would begin by answering it by looking at the work of Lorraine Daston, who is an intellectual historian working on Europe. And she, I think, makes the argument very convincingly in an article called How Did Nature Become the Other, or something like that, and is looking particularly at 17th century developments within natural sciences. And that is the time of the creation of mechanistic science or mechanical philosophy, two names for the same thing, in which we end up in a world where the non-human is just dead matter to be manipulated for human purposes. And what she says is that we today tend to be anti-anthropomorphic because we are anti-anthropocentric. And she says that that if you look at what's going on then, they meaning the articulators of mechanical philosophy, were anti-anthropomorphic because they were pro-anthropocentric. So that the philosophy of exploitation of nature depended upon doing anthropomorphism in. That's a fancy, maybe historical, intellectual historical way of looking at it, but I think very, very productive. I would say in looking at the two, anthropocentrism is making the claim that human beings are radically other than all life forms on the planet, that either we're superior to all other life forms or even outside of that system altogether, and that this is human exceptionalism in its most radical form. Where anthropomorphism is really making the claim that there's a relationship between life forms. It is acknowledging that as humans, we do have a tendency to establish our most intimate relationships with other humans, and therefore it's in looking at the relationships, maybe the shared relationships with life forms, and emphasizing those, that our relationship with other non-human beings then can become enhanced. And that's why I wanted to at least mention something about a lot of the literature that is being produced within the scientific community about face recognition. I'm also interested in this is a time when in the academy anthropomorphism is being reconsidered because it's been denigrated severely. In the field of ethology, animal behavior, there's a talk of committing the sin of anthropomorphism. But someone like Jane Goodall and her colleagues, such as Mark Beckhoff at the University of Colorado, I think, are owning the term anthropomorphism as a very positive term because, again, it's a term that is recognizing relationship and relationality rather than separateness, where anthropomorphism establishes a hard boundary between human and non-human. Anthropomorphism crosses that boundary. And if you look in there's lots of developments, but I'm particularly interested in what's happening in the field of social psychology. There's a team of scientists based at the University of Chicago, headed by Nicholas Epley, who are looking at anthropomorphism, particularly in the context of human relationships with domestic pets. And there's a consensus within the field of social psychology these days that says the key to human well-being is the feeling of connectedness, that really is the core of human well-being, connectedness. And that it's through anthropomorphization of a domestic pet that connectedness is deepened. And that could be as simple as naming one's pet. But anthropomorphism goes beyond that. I'm particularly interested then, and they look at the way that the anthropomorphization is not just productive for human beings or beneficial from the human side, but also the way the anthropomorphized entity is treated. It's treated much better in that context than when it's not. And they then kind of suggest that this is in an environmental context. Well, that's been taken up by another team of environmental social psychologists based at Hong Kong University, led by Kim Pong Tam, where they have concluded in their work that when one anthropomorphizes some natural entity, and they are interested in trees and such things now, that again their conclusion is that the connection is much deeper, and they're most interested in their finding that the care, the protection, the conservation of those natural entities is also enhanced. So I guess all that suggests is that there is a great distinction between anthropocentrism, which again is all about human exceptionalism and the separateness, and anthropomorphization, which is more relationality, recognizing kinship and affinity with other beings.
I would just add to that, I've spent a lot of time preparing for today, and it's been reinforced throughout the morning of trying to think about how, for people that live in this valley, live here, this is the world, how to not only understand but to care about something as far away as northern Thailand. I would suspect most of you have never been there. It can be very hard to conceptualize that. And then when it's a group of people who have a very different perspective on the world and a different belief system that is very unusual to our own, how do you find ways of making it relevant and meaningful for somebody to be able to grasp? So one thing that I don't think I succeeded in that this morning, but one of the things I was thinking about is the drought issue in northern Thailand caused by deforestation that the monks are then trying to deal with is something that people here can relate to. And I think that the idea of anthropomorphism, as Deborah Haberman was saying, is trying to find ways of building those connections, of making something very relevant and meaningful in people's lives that you can begin to have an empathy for somebody or something that's very, very different from your own understanding of the world, if you can make those connections. And if it means wrapping an orange robe around a tree to make people stop and think about why and how they depend upon that tree and the larger nature that it's part of, that it then moves people towards behavior that can help protect the natural world, the forest, then I think the anthropomorphism is valuable. It's a way of helping to translate. If you just go in and talk to people about the science of this tree and how it holds water and how it holds the soil, and yes, that can get a lot of people motivated to realize you cut down the tree, you're going to have drought, you're going to have erosion, you're going to have flash floods. But there's not then an empathy built towards taking care of nature. Because we all naturally, I think the psychology is a key role here, want to take care of our own. That's human nature. So if we can expand what is our own, then we can start to get more into that interconnectedness of all life, and that we're part of that. So I think that's what a lot of these monks are motivated to be doing in that role of anthropomorphism. Anthropocentrism is a whole nother thing, and I'll stop there.
This issue of anthropomorphism and idolatry comes to the very heart of how you can actually use religious language at all. The basic rule in the Hebrew tradition that comes through into the Christian tradition is that you worship the Creator and not the creature. And the creatures also worship the Creator. But we have a problem of language. because human language has evolved to deal with and to represent the material world. And we are trying to use that language to describe something that by definition is beyond the material world. And so when you read in the Hebrew scriptures, and to a lesser extent in the Greek scriptures that are the New Testament, but mainly in the Hebrew scriptures, when you read the reports of the great visionaries trying to describe what they saw, what they experienced when they record the vision of God, you will find that the characteristic language all the way through acknowledges that they use human terms, but those are as if, like, in the shape of, in the form of. If you read the first chapter, for example, of the prophet Ezekiel, he is describing the vision of God, and he is describing something, but he hasn't quite got the words for it, that is like the glory of God, and it is as though it is in the form of something like a man, and it's about as vague and distant as he can get, but he hasn't got the language. Now, if you read Ezekiel chapter 1 in Hebrew, it's very, very difficult. If you read it in an old translation of the English, like the King James Version, there you can read the English and you can think, what on earth was that about? If you read a modern translation that seems to make sense, it's not a good translation, because the Hebrew itself is very, very difficult. And then you extend this to two other ways. How is it possible to represent the divine in this material world? And there are two main ways that you do it in the Christian tradition. One is with the sacred symbols. So when we break bread, that focuses a whole lot of teaching that is really beyond words. But because you're steeped in that tradition, when you break bread, you know you're not just breaking bread like you might do at your breakfast table in order to put butter on it or whatever it is. The same is true with wine, the same is true with water. All these everyday, ordinary symbols carry a whole lot of teaching that is beyond words. And then the other one, which is more controversial, is the question of holy pictures. In the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church, very important place is given to the icon. And the icon, they would say, is a window into heaven. You don't worship the icon, but you venerate what is depicted and represented there. You see through that icon, almost literally, into the divine reality that was manifested in the life of that person. So the whole business of anthropomorphism is tied up, yes, with idolatry, but also with the problem of how you actually represent the state beyond words in words which necessarily evolved to deal with the human situation.
Let's say a show of appreciation one more time for our outstanding panel and the excellent questions that were posed.